we started a discussion of the intertestamental period. I want to do a little review, see if you were paying attention. We'll see. The intertestamental period is obviously the time between the testaments. Approximately how many years does that cover? Ah, yes, very good. Book of Malachi ends with the prediction of Elijah, and then, of course, John the Baptist appears on the scene, who Jesus calls the Elijah who was to come. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about some of the different periods in Jewish history during this intertestamental time. And we talked first about the Persian rule, Jews under the Persians, and basically a number of developments come during this time. You remember in 539, Cyrus gives this decree for the Jews who were in exile to return to their homeland and do what? Build the temple, rebuild the temple. Now, where do we learn about that decree in the Old Testament? Ezra, right. First few verses of the book of Ezra tell us about that. And what is, under this period, what is some of the developments? Nathaniel? Okay, let's just, rise of the synagogues. Why did the synagogues arise? The temple was destroyed. The Jews go off into exile, and they're also dispersed all over the place. Even when they return, a number of them return to Jerusalem, return to their homeland. Even during the Hellenistic period, they're spread all over the place. Do you remember the term for that? Diaspora, or the dispersion. Right. You can enjoy looking at my kids here. No, it's too distracting because they're so cute. So. Okay, and so they recognize that the God-appointed place for sacrifice to be offered was the temple. And so since they didn't have access to the temple, they would meet in these places called synagogues, and they would read the Word, read the Torah, and pray, and the synagogues develop, and so they're a well-established institution by the time of the New Testament. We see Jesus in the synagogues. We see Paul visiting the synagogues. What else happens during this period? Okay. Scribes, first of all. Many of these scribes were priests. They're basically out of a job, so they turn to studying the Torah, copying the Torah. As they do that, they learn a lot. They become sort of the theologians, but also this development of oral law. And we looked at Mark 7, 1 through 8, where Jesus mentions how this tradition had grown up alongside the written law and added all kinds of things. And the Pharisees at the time of the Gospels, Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees, they were so committed to the traditions of men, this oral law, that in many cases they were setting aside the intent of the law. What else happens during this time? Aramaic becomes the main language. Even in Palestine, Aramaic becomes the language of business and the main language that people spoke. Okay, Alexander the Great comes to power, and his kingdom spreads rapidly. And what does Alexander do throughout this new empire? He Hellenizes this empire, which means what? Right, he imposes Greek culture, Greek language on this vast territory, which will, by the time of the New Testament, will be the Roman Empire. But this means there is a common language throughout a vast stretch of land. So by the time Paul shows shows up on the scene and carries out his missionary journeys, he's able to preach in a language that everyone understands. We also mentioned because of this, there was a need in the dispersion for the people to have, the Jews rather, to have the Old Testament translated into Greek. And what is the name of this translation? The Septuagint. The Septuagint. And the Septuagint is often quoted in the New Testament. Okay, I think we left off last time with the Jews under the Ptolemies. After Alexander dies, his kingdom is split before 4 of his generals, and then down to 2 main dynasties. What were those 2 dynasties? Seleucid and, hard one to say, Ptolemaic. Right. And basically, Israel is caught in the middle. The Seleucid Empire is really headquartered in Syria. What's the capital of Syria, by the way? Do you know? Believers were first called Christians in this city. Antioch, and the name of the rulers of the Seleucid Empire or kingdom was what? Antiochus. Antioch, Antiochus might be a way to remember. Okay, so Israel, Palestine, is sort of a battleground between the northern Seleucid dynasty and then the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is centered more in Egypt. And so Israel, there are many battles for Israel and back and forth. But basically by about about 300s or so, the Ptolemies take control of Israel, and they're basically they allow the Jews to continue with a lot of freedom. It's very a peaceful time, relatively speaking, for the Jews under the Ptolemies, which is a good thing. However, after that, and this is, I think, where we left off, the Seleucids come to control Israel by 198. Did we talk about that yet?
Yeah, that was the last point.
Okay, that was the last point. So let's go there. And no, we don't want to go there. We want to go right here. Nope. 4. Here we go. Okay. Did we mention Antiochus yet, the 4th? Okay, let's talk about Antiochus the 4th. He comes to power in 175 BC, and he is a pretty brutal dictator. He is, unlike the Ptolemies, he does not allow the Jews to have freedom. This is not a peaceful time for the Jews. He referred to himself, or took the title as Antiochus Epiphanes, which meant what? Remember from your reading? I think this might have been included. Basically, a manifest God. Epiphanes, the idea of manifest. So he viewed himself as a great leader, a god, although his enemies or opponents would give him a different title, Epimenes, which means madman. So a bit of a play on words there. They did not like him, and they thought he was crazy. Antiochus really brutalized the Jews. He persecuted the Jews, and a number of things that he did. For example, he robbed the temple in Jerusalem, desecrated the temple in many ways, but he took all the valuable things from the temple. He killed thousands of Jews. He burned parts of Jerusalem. Let me just read for you an account of some of the things that took place under Antiochus IV. And this account comes from 1 Maccabees, which is in the part of the Apocrypha. Roberta, I think, last time asked about the Apocrypha. Much of the Apocrypha is written during this time, and a lot of it, at least the Maccabees books and some others, describe some of the history that takes place. 1 Maccabees is fairly reliable, so let me read an account. By the way, before I do that, let me again encourage you to, I will in a minute, use that CD that's part of your textbook, Encountering the New Testament. And let me just show you a couple of examples of how it can be valuable. I mentioned the glossary before. If you go to the glossary, you can see it's organized alphabetically here. You probably can't see this column very well, but if we go to, let's say you come across this term Apocrypha, and you're like, what's that? You can go to Apocrypha, and it'll pronounce it. I don't know if the sound's hooked up here, but Apocrypha will give you a brief little description. Let me read that for you. It's specifically a collection of 14 Jewish books written mainly between 200 BC and 100 AD, sometimes also called deuterocanonical, that is secondary canonical status, books of the Old Testament. These books, the Apocrypha, from which I'm going to read in a minute, are attached to the Septuagint, or part of the Septuagint. They're included in the Septuagint. So they're really, even though they describe the intertestamental time, they're usually included with the Old Testament books. These books are not found in the Hebrew Old Testament, but they are included in the Bible used by Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodoxy. Protestants regard them as valuable historical and literary works, but do not consider them authoritative for doctrine and practice. Okay, so brief little description there. Let's jump up to Antiochus. Antiochus and Epiphanes. Okay, it gives you a description of him. Alexander the Great. So there are all kinds of these terms that you're going to come across, and use this glossary because it'll be helpful for you in clarifying what some terms are. There's also some maps here and review questions. The answers to the review questions I mentioned for the exams can be found on this disc as well, so it's worth playing around. Okay, that commercial's over. Okay, so all that to say, what I'm going to read to you comes from 1 Maccabees, included in the Apocrypha. And listen to the description of what the Jews endured under Antiochus. This is 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 44 through 50. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and feasts, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and unclean... What are swine? Pigs, right. Now, why would that be so offensive? They're unclean. The Old Testament, the Torah, considered them unclean animals. Now, the other thing here, notice it said, set up pagan altars, basically, and forced idol worship, that was especially offensive to many in this community. Of course, there were a number of Jews who compromised and went along with this. But this was especially offensive because, remember, we mentioned when the Jews returned from exile, they were determined to learn the lesson. They didn't want to go back into exile. And so idolatry was especially offensive to many of them. And so Antiochus Epiphanes sets up these altars for them to worship foreign gods. And to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by every unclean and profane, by everything unclean and profane, so that they should forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. And so you can see many Jews were killed. As we mentioned here, circumcision was prohibited. Other sacred practices, the observance of the Sabbath, was prohibited. Scriptures were destroyed. In fact, the death penalty would be inflicted if you were caught possessing or even reading the Torah. Let me read just another little section here from 1 Maccabees. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 140th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding cities of Judah and burned incense at the doors of the houses in the streets. The books of the law which they found they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of anyone, or if one adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned him to death. So not only reading the law, but trying to obey it could get you killed. They kept using violence against Israel, against those found month after month in the cities. And on the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar, which was upon the altar of burnt offering, that is, to a foreign god. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant. And they did die, and very great wrath came upon Israel. Okay, so you can see how brutal Antiochus was. Set up pagan altars, not just in Jerusalem, but throughout Judah. And they were forced to worship idols, or they could be killed. Now here's the ultimate offense. And we read some of it here in 1 Maccabees. Antiochus Epiphanes set up an image of Zeus, Greek god, on the altar in the temple. And a few days later, he sacrificed a pig in the temple on the altar. Now that was the height of offenses to the Jews. This, in fact, was predicted in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 11, starting around, I think about verse 24, it describes Antiochus Epiphanes, predicts his rule and some of the things he will do. And most Bible scholars believe that Daniel 11:31 is a reference to this action of setting up the image of Zeus. Here's what the verse says. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And that was, again, many people believe that this is the reference, Daniel 11:31, to what happened in December 167, when Antiochus had Zeus, the image of Zeus, set up in the temple. Abomination of desolation. Now, all this gives rise to faithful Jews who resisted, and we saw that in the end of chapter 1 of 1 Maccabees. It says that many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled. And the name for these faithful Jews, at least some of them, is often called the Hasidim, the pious ones, the holy ones. Questions? Yes. The Ark of the Covenant, off the top of my head, I'm not sure what's going on with that. Yeah. Now, all of this leads to, obviously the Jews can only endure this for so long without revolting. So all of this leads to a revolt. Eventually there's going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back. The Jews are not going to endure this forever. And so that leads us to what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And eventually this will lead to the Hasmonean dynasty, which is Jewish. We'll look at this, but it's basically Jews ruling in Palestine. The Maccabean Revolt. Again, this is described for us in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So if you want to read an account of it, it's a very interesting story. It's interesting reading. So you can find it in the Apocrypha. But again, given the severity of Antiochus' actions against the Jews, it's no surprise that eventually a revolt comes. The straw that breaks the camel's back is when an old priest by the name of Mattathias of a small town called Modin, he was ordered, one of the Antiochus' representatives come to Modin, which was a common occurrence, and wants to see the sacrifice to the idols conducted. And so he goes to this priest, Mattathias. He's an elderly priest. He's sort of the town leader, and he wants him to perform this idolatrous sacrifice. Well, Mattathias refused. And when he refused, there came forward an apostate Jew, someone who had compromised with all that was going on and said, I'll do it. Well, this leads Mattathias to say enough is enough. So not only does he refuse to offer pagan sacrifices, he kills this Jew who comes forward to perform the sacrifice. And he also killed the king's representative. But fortunately, the media was there with their cameras, and we have a picture of the very scene. Yeah, so this, in fact, is the beginning of a major revolt. And so Mattathias and his 5 sons, as a result of this, fled to the Judean hill country. And news of this spreads. Everyone's sending emails to each other, and word gets out that this happens, and Mattathias is considered a hero. And many other Jews join with him. Many of these Hasidim, these pious ones, join with him, and they organize sort of a guerrilla army, a band of rebel Jews. And they surprisingly win some impressive victories over the Syrian or the Seleucid forces. Mattathias dies in 166, and his son Judas continues these attacks. And he was nicknamed Maccabeus, which is a Greek term for hammer. Judas the Hammer. Sounds like a wrestling name or something. But Judas the Hammer, Judas Maccabeus, and thus this is called the Maccabean Revolt. We have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees. He actually not only continues the revolt, but is successful to the point of, by December 164, not sure if I have this, I don't. December 164, you don't have to remember these dates, but just if you're following the chronology here, he actually gains control of the temple in Jerusalem and purifies it. You remember how badly defiled Antiochus had rendered the temple. And so the temple is purified, and all these events are commemorated, celebrated today with a new feast that comes out of these events that is called the Feast of Dedication, or now it's known as Hanukkah. So if you were wondering what Hanukkah is, you can't find that in the Old Testament. Well, that comes out of this intertestamental period in the Maccabean Revolt. In fact, the Feast of Dedication is referred to in the New Testament. John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, at that time the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. Jesus was walking in the temple. Antiochus dies that same year, 164, and Judas and his brothers continue to fight Syrian troops. Judas himself dies a few years later, but his brothers continue this cause, and in fact, they come to be known as the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty. Now, you might wonder, where does that name come from? Hasmon was the great-great-grandfather of Mattathias. So that's where the term Hasmonean comes from. These are descendants of Mattathias who rule in Judah. They are also high priests, and this is a little confusing. How does this group become the class of high priest rulers? Now, you don't have to remember all this, but just in case you're interested, basically what's going on here is Mattathias was a priest, okay, but he was not of the high priestly clan. The high priest was not only to be a Levite, he was also to be of the clan of Zadok. Basically, what's going on is after Judas Maccabeus dies, he's succeeded by Jonathan, his brother, and this one, Jonathan, is appointed by the Seleucids as high priest, even though everyone recognized that he wasn't a legitimate heir to the high priestly office. But they thought, okay, well, this will be a stopgap measure, and we'll accept this. Things are going well. Well, Jonathan is succeeded by his brother Simon. Simon, and again, you don't have to remember all these details, but it's kind of interesting. And it does have a point. It does lead us to understand what's going on in the time of the New Testament with the high priest. Okay, so Simon comes after Jonathan. Simon secures some treaty with Rome, and this grants political freedom for the Jews. In the process, Simon is officially recognized by all as high priest and his successors. So this establishes the Hasmonean dynasty as a group of high priests. Now, as things continue, the original ideals of the Maccabees, the Mattathias and his immediate sons, and the resistance to all this corruption, all those ideals over time, over decades, are lost. In fact, the Hasmonean dynasty becomes pretty corrupt. And so you still nevertheless have some of these Hasidim, these pure ones, who try to call, after time when things corrupt, degenerate, the Hasidim are the ones trying to call people back to the law. And a number of scholars think it's out of this group that the Pharisees arise, calling people back to the law, to the traditions. Okay? Now, when Herod the Great, when the Romans come to power, and then eventually Herod the Great, we'll talk about him in a minute, when he comes to power, he ends this Hasmonean rule, and he's the one who appoints high priests. And this continues in the time of the New Testament. When you look at the New Testament, you see the high priests. These are appointed by Roman rulers, and which sort of explains why they tend to have the ear of the Roman rulers. You see that in the crucifixion of Jesus with Pilate. And basically, by the time of the New Testament, you have this high priestly class. They're sort of an elite group, and they're certain families. They serve as the chief priests, and you see them a number of times in the New Testament. They're almost always viewed in a negative light. They oppose Jesus. Okay. That was just a little footnote on the Hasmonean dynasty as a group of high priests and how the New Testament, by the time of the New Testament, that development changes, and you have the Gentiles appointing the high priests in Judah. By 142 BC, the Seleucid presence is basically removed from Palestine. And so the Jews are free to have their independence. And basically this results in about 80 years of Jewish independence, Jewish freedom. And basically and that ends, by the way, in 63 when the Romans take over. We'll look at that in a minute. But you have about an 80-year period when the Jews are independent. They are free. And by the way, the Jews would, after the Romans take over in 63 BC, the Jews would never have that freedom again until the reestablishment of modern Israel after World War II. Developments from the Maccabean period. What is the result of all of this history? What is the significance for the New Testament as we come to study the New Testament? Well, there is some significant background. We have to understand this period to understand Judaism in the first century. One of the things that develops in the Maccabean period is an intensified Jew-Gentile animosity. That is, Jewish nationalism really is taken to a new level because the Jews were so much mistreated by Antiochus IV. They come to hate Gentiles because the Gentiles, the Antiochus, the Seleucids, forced them to compromise, did so many evil things, burned their scriptures, the abomination of desolation, setting up a false god in their temple, sacrificing a pig in the temple. All of this made the Jews really despise Gentiles. And also, you have this heroic Maccabean revolt ushering in this time of peace, and so Jewish nationalism is really at its height. And that helps us to explain the Jew-Gentile animosity when we come into the New Testament. And Paul's continually battling that this was such a hard thing for those early believers to accept, those early Jewish believers to accept, that Gentiles were on an equal level before God as Jews. And you sense that all over the place in the New Testament. Let's just look at one example in Acts, the book of Acts. So turn to Acts chapter 21. Acts 21 and 22. We'll look at a couple of examples here. Okay, you'll remember the context here. Basically, Paul is arrested in the temple. And let's look at a couple of different sections. Acts 21, 27 through 32. Does someone have that passage for us and want to read it for us? Verses 27 through 32. Who's going to read for us? Okay. So what is it that drives the people crazy into a frenzy? What did Paul do that was so offensive? Or what did they think Paul did? Brought a Gentile into the temple. Now, if you know the Maccabean history and the history with Antiochus Epiphanes, that makes a lot more sense why they would be so enraged by this action. Okay, chapter 22, let's jump ahead in this account. Remember, Paul, in the remaining verses, chapter 21, he begins to make his speech to the people. Someone read verses 1 and 2. Okay. So, when he's addressing the Jews in the Hebrew dialect, which means Aramaic, they listened. They listened. So, you can see this sort of Jewish nationalism. Oh, he's going to speak to us in our language. Okay, now a couple more verses. Chapter 22, verse 20 through 23. And when the blood, verse 20, and when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself, this is Paul's testimony, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, and etc., etc. So they go crazy when Paul claims that God told him to go to the Gentiles. And then they just lose it. They listened to him up until that point, but at that point, they went crazy. Okay, so you can see how Jew-Gentile hostility is so present in the New Testament. What other examples can you think of? What group arose among the early believers to oppose Paul and some of the other early teachers? Who did Paul constantly battle with? The Judaizers. What did the Judaizers want to do? Right. They just could not get over the fact that we still aren't followers of the law. And so, yes, okay, it's fine to believe in Jesus, but you also need circumcision. Galatians is a huge argument against that kind of thing. So you see this throughout the New Testament, and it's really helpful to understand the background as to what led the Jews to be so hostile. Okay, another development here is there is a longing for a restored kingship, which is really a messianic hope. Messianic hope. by the time the Romans took over, which we're coming to, but by the time the Romans took over in the first centuries, this messianic hope, this messianic expectation was very strong in certain circles. Thank you. I'll get it out yet. But the expectation was sort of modeled on Judas Maccabeus. Okay, so it comes from this Maccabean period, this golden age, and this time when Mattathias and his sons stand up to the powers that be and then ultimately usher in a measure of freedom. And so that was sort of the messianic model. And that's why when you see in the Gospels people's expectations for Jesus are just completely different from what he came to do. They wanted a political leader that would deliver them from Roman rule, just like Judas Maccabees. Okay, so that was their model and that was their expectation. Another development here is what I mentioned already. The Maccabean ideals faded as the decades go on, and so this group of the Pharisees emerge, calling Jews back to the law. And you'll see lots of references to the Pharisees in the Gospels. You'll also see this term, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the official Pharisaic judicial arm. Okay. We're almost done with this history, then we'll get into the actual text of the New Testament. So we're almost there. The Roman period, 63 BC. Rome had been actually growing as a power from about 280 BC onward, but in 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey takes Jerusalem. He'd already taken a vast amount of territory, and now by 63 he takes Jerusalem. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, all the details of the transition, but there are a couple of points that we need to note that will help us in terms of New Testament background. The governor of Judah at this time, that is when Pompey takes Jerusalem, is someone by the name of Antipater. And basically Rome had conferred on him local political leadership. Rome established, as they took over various territories, they would establish what you might call something like client kings. That is, regional kings who would be loyal to Rome but would govern certain areas. And if they weren't loyal to Caesar, then Rome would come in and displace them. But Antipater ruled from about 63 to 43, so about 20 years. And he does something, in AD 47, he does something to help the imperial troops, the Roman troops. Not sure exactly what he does, but he helps them. These troops are down around Egypt, Alexandria. He helps them, and the emperor at the time, Julius Caesar, is very grateful. And so in return, Julius does things like reduce Israel's taxes, but the most important thing is he grants the Jews and Judaism the status of a legal religion, okay, which gives the Jews a measure of freedom in this Roman era. And you see that in the New Testament. The Jews they're allowed to continue in their religion, in Judaism. The Romans have a strong presence there, to be sure, but the Jews have freedom to carry on. And significantly, as Roman religion develops and they come to honor Caesar as a god, and in fact enforced loyalty to Caesar by acknowledging Caesar as Lord, you were forced to do that. The Jews were exempt. The Jews were exempt because of this status they had as a legal religion. They did not have to do that. Now, Antipater's son is whom? Herod the Great. Herod the Great. What do we know about Herod the Great? Anything? Yes, right. Matthew chapter 2, remember the wise men visit. This is who they visit, Herod. And Herod is the one who has the children killed, the babies killed in Bethlehem. Obviously, that indicates he has some serious character flaws, as most politicians do. But generally, he's pretty good to the Jews. He's a brilliant architect and builder, and so the temple after Herod is referred to as Herod's temple because he did a lot of remodeling, rebuilding, expanding this temple which had been run down, and so it's called Herod's temple. When Herod dies, his kingdom is divided among 3 of his sons, and all 3 guys show up in the New Testament. Archelaus rules very briefly Judea and Samaria, and he is brutal to the Jews as well, harsh on the Jews, and basically an incompetent leader, so Rome deposes him. But notice, let's turn to Matthew 2, because we have a reference to Archelaus. Notice verse 22, 21 for context. Actually, verse 19 for context. But when Herod died, that is Herod the Great, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. That is Herod the Great. So it's safe to come back. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, that what was spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled. He shall be called a Nazarene. So in the providence of God, God actually uses this bad ruler who was harsh towards the Jews to fulfill Scripture. So Joseph, instead of going back to Jerusalem or Judea, he actually goes back up into Galilee and settles in Nazareth, so the Scriptures might be fulfilled. Another of Herod's sons is Antipas, and he is given control of Galilee and Perea. And we the New Testament mentions him on a couple of occasions. The Mark 6 reference is to his connection with John the Baptist. What did Antipas, who's sometimes also called Herod, what did Antipas do to John the Baptist? Yep, exactly. You remember that story. He didn't really want to do it, but he had to in order to keep his word. The Luke reference is to the trial of Jesus. And Jesus is sent for a time because Pilate hears that Jesus is from Galilee, so he sends him to Herod Antipas because that's Herod's or Antipas's district or region, and Herod questions Jesus, is very interested, but then he eventually sends him back to Pilate. Third son, Philip, he takes control of the north, east of the Sea of Galilee, and he's mentioned in the New Testament a couple of times. There's one reference to him in Luke 3:11. He's also mentioned alongside of Herod Antipas. Do you remember the connection there? What did Herod do that John didn't like? He criticized him for it. Yes, he took his brother's wife, his brother being Philip. So, nice guy. Yeah. Now, we don't know as much about Philip, but he did, in a great act of humility, he did name a city after himself. Himself and Caesar. So there's where the humility comes in. And what is the name of that city? Caesarea Philippi. Right? Okay. Now, what happens in Caesarea Philippi? Something very important happens. Matthew chapter 16, Jesus and the disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, and yes, Peter's great confession takes place in Caesarea Philippi. Okay. Questions on any of this? We'll review some of it and go over, try to bring out some of the significance of it as we continue. But that's probably enough history for one day. Ivan? They were defeated by the Seleucids. And in fact, Antiochus IV fights them a couple of more times, and one time he's actually more or less defeated, and he comes back very angry, and that's a lot of when some of the brutality against the Jews comes, because he's in a bad mood from losing to the Ptolemaics. So he takes it out on the Jews. Okay, now obviously there's a lot of other significant details when we're talking about Rome and its influence on the New Testament, Roman rule. And so we'll talk about that as we get into the course more. Nero, Pilate, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. We'll come back to those things as needed.